My name is Alvin Jackson, and I'm the Dean of Research for the College of Humanities and Social Science, and I'm representing the college this evening. And it's my pleasure to introduce our inaugural lecturer, Professor Susan McVie, who has been appointed to the chair of Quantitative Criminology. Susan was born in Edinburgh and grew up in the Scottish borders and in Perthshire, attending both Eyemouth and Perth high schools. She graduated in biological sciences from Edinburgh Napier, followed by an MSc in legal studies and criminology from this university. After graduating from Edinburgh in 1992, she entered the civil service as a research officer in the criminology research branch of the Central Research Unit of the Scottish Office, and there she honed the skills in both quantitative and qualitative research methods by working on a broad range of applied policy research projects in the areas of policing, prosecution, and courts-based research. And after being promoted to senior research officer, she became responsible for the Scottish Crime Survey and project managed 2 iterations of this large-scale national enterprise before leaving to take up a research post here at Edinburgh in 1998. She's retained close links with both analysts and policymakers throughout her career. In addition to returning to the civil service for a brief secondment in 2004, she has served on a large number of Scottish Government committees and programme boards. She's provided expert evidence on a broad range of crime, justice, and methodological related matters. She's run training courses for government analysts, presented evidence to the Scottish Parliament Justice Committee. She became Senior Research Fellow in 1998 on the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions and Crime before taking on the co-directorship of the study in 2007. And over that time, she has managed 6 annual sweeps of this large-scale longitudinal study of youth offending with a cohort of over 4,000 respondents. And gradually, this study has evolved into a major research programme, which has now been running for 16 years and is recognised as one of the largest and most important studies in the field of criminology. Her leadership role in taking forward the strategic development and implementation of the research programme is widely hailed as a key component of its success. In fact, this success can be measured in various ways by the major research grants which the study has won from the ESRC, the Nuffield Foundation, the Scottish Government. And the findings from the study have been widely disseminated and have impacted significantly both on academic and intellectual debate and on youth justice policy, practice, and legislation in Scotland. In 2013, Susan and Professor Leslie McCara were awarded the Howard League for Penal Reform Research Medal for excellence in research impact. In 2006, Susan was part of a major collaborative bid led by the Universities of Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Stirling to establish the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, the SCCJR. And as leader of the CJ Quest Network, one of 5 strategic research strands within SCCJR, Susan has pursued her goal to promote the use of large-scale survey methodology, advanced statistical analysis, and complex data modelling within criminology in Scotland. Identifying a major deficit in capacity and critical mass in Scotland, which threatened to undermine the success of future research development within social science disciplines at a national level, she led a 1.2 million bid to the ESRC to establish a pan-Scottish multidisciplinary network of scholars known as the Applied Quantitative Methods Network, or Acumen. And as director of Acumen, she has made a significant contribution to the strategic advancement of capacity building and quantitative methods. Since 2009, Acumen has become a UK leader in the field of high-quality quantitative methods training, both for academics as well as non-academics. And in 2013, Acumen became a research centre with around £4 million funding from the ESRC to establish a broad programme of research that focuses upon crime and victimisation, education and social stratification, urban segregation and inequality, and public attitudes on Scottish independence. Susan has secured over £6 million in research funding as principal investigator and a further 4.5 million as co-investigator on grant applications, figures that will warm the heart of any Dean of Research. She has engaged in a wide range of research projects during her 22-year career in criminology, but her primary research interest has been youth offending and youth justice, mainly through the Edinburgh study of youth transitions and crime, which began tracking routes into and out of offending for a cohort of over 4,000 young people beginning at age 12. And 16 years later, the Edinburgh study continues to explore the long-term criminal justice outcomes for this large group of young people. Her publications include a high-profile series of articles on youth crime and justice based on this Edinburgh study, co-written often with Leslie McCara, through which has emerged new knowledge about factors associated with youth offending and the impact of youth justice interventions. The article, Youth Justice, the Impact of Agency Contact and Desistance from Offending, published in 2007 and co-authored with Leslie, is the most cited article in the European Journal of Criminology and is widely regarded as the most important paper to be published in the field of youth justice in the last decade. And through widespread engagement with policymakers and practitioners, Susan's research has led directly to reform in youth justice policy and practice in Scotland and has had influence in many other countries. Three major examples of her impact include influencing the amendment of the Children's Hearing Scotland Act 2011 relating to the status of childhood offences admitted at children's hearings, providing the evidence base for the Scottish Government's reforms to youth justice and the national implementation of the whole system approach, WSA, in September 2011, and changing the policy and practice response to youth offending within the city of Edinburgh. Her research achievement has justly been recognised through election to the Fellowship of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Unsurprisingly, given her biography, you can see her image as a woman of inspiration in the photographic exhibition in the Edinburgh University Visitor Centre. Her spare time is spent with her family, her husband, and her two primary school-age children. And at weekends, I gather, she is frequently to be found standing on the edge of a football pitch in support of her son's team or marshalling at her daughter's trampolining competition. But she's also managed to embark upon a new programme of research on crime and victimisation, which aims to explore the dramatic change in patterns of crime that have been observed in Scotland in recent years. And this lecture will draw on some of the early findings from this research. I'm truly delighted to invite Susan to deliver her inaugural Painting by Numbers, the Changing Landscape of Crime in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Alvin. Oh, you can already see what the outline is. I've had an inaugural described in various different ways. It's like going to your own wedding without your partner. It's like going to a funeral where you know everybody in the audience, but they don't know each other. Although I imagine you have to be better dressed in an inaugural than in your funeral. And it's also an opportunity to do something that you wouldn't normally do in a lecture. And I think I've decided to go for that third option, which is to talk about some of the things that I wouldn't normally talk about in a lecture, it'll be somewhere between a bit of a historical reenactment of my career, a bit of an Oscars Awards ceremony speech, but also the introduction to some of the research that we're starting to develop in the Acumen project, and some of the work that we've done over the years in the Edinburgh study. I hope to persuade you of my enthusiasm for research, particularly research that uses numbers and large-scale data sets and big surveys, and my enthusiasm for understanding more about patterns and pictures of crime. I think it's a hugely important area of social policy, and one that, despite the huge importance that we place on it in social terms and economic terms and many other terms, one that we don't actually know a tremendous amount about. So I'm going to start with my journey and the people that I've met along the way, and that gives me an opportunity to say thank you, which is another good reason for doing an inaugural, is that you get to thank all the people that have helped you along the way and supported you and been there when you've needed them. And I want to kind of start with, I'm going to skip past my first degree, although I might mention it a little bit later. But I'm going to start with criminology at Edinburgh, past and present, because I joined the Faculty of Law here back in the early 1990s to do a Master's in Legal Studies, and it had criminology at the end in brackets. Criminology has since been promoted, so it's now the MSc in Criminology and Criminal Justice, but in those days it was Legal Studies. And I was inspired by what I would consider to be some of the greatest scholars that we've had within criminology, certainly in Scotland, possibly wider than that, certainly internationally in some cases. Criminology at the Edinburgh Law School has a very, very long history. It started here about 50 years ago with the establishment of the School for Criminology and Forensic Studies, and it was a very multidisciplinary centre. It included social policy people, psychologists, sociologists, psychologists, lawyers. I don't think it actually included anyone who called themselves a criminologist back then, but that came exactly 40 years ago this year when Derek McClintock was appointed Professor of Criminology here in the law school. I think that was notable in two very important respects. First of all, it was only the second such chair in the whole of the UK, so Edinburgh was at the forefront of developing criminology. The second point is that it heralded a broadening of research interest within the school, and particularly in terms of the empirical methods that were used to study crime and other areas within criminology here. I've noted three particular people here who are sadly no longer with us, but these are three people that had a particular impact on inspiring me in criminology. Derek McClintock, who was still the Professor of Criminology when I came here to study, I was very lucky to be one of the last students to study under him. He was a tremendous inspiration. He brought a huge amount of realism to his teaching because he had a vast amount of research experience. The references that he made to the work that he'd done on studying crime trends in England and Wales, and also the empirical research that he did on crimes of violence and mentally disordered offenders, often with an international bent, was very, very inspiring. And a very memorable aspect for me of his teaching was the importance of using empirical research methods, both quantitative and qualitative. And yet, in those days, there was no such thing as a methods course. So I left with a degree in criminology without ever having studied a methods course, and yet I felt equipped to go out and do research. The once met, never forgotten Richard Kinsey. I'm sure there's a few of you in the audience that will remember him. The first in a long line of disillusioned lawyers that I've met in my career who turned into criminologists. He inspired us with his radical ideas. He introduced us to the new criminology, and he taught us how to get the most out of a ride along the back of a police car. A highly underrated scholar, I think, who extolled the virtues of empirical research and led the research that is still regularly referred to as one of the most landmark pieces of research on young people in crime, known as Cautionary Tales. I know Simon's in the audience too, who's also involved in that research. And finally, Neil McCormick, a true scholar and gentleman, still sadly missed in the school, tried his best to find the legal philosopher in me, and gave a fine masterclass on how to balance precipitously on two legs of a chair while he regaled us with tales of Bentham and Hobbes. And at Neil's insistence, I bought a copy of Alan Ryan's The Philosophy of the Social Sciences, and that book has heavily influenced me in terms of the theoretical approach that I've taken to my research, particularly on the causal explanations of human behaviour. Mostly actually what I remember about being a student in the law school here was the sheer number of men, including Dave Garland, Peter Young, Neil Walker, Ian Loader, all of whom taught me, and I'm immensely grateful to them. There are a few notable exceptions. Beverly Brown and Lynn Jameson were here and sadly didn't teach me, but if I could have projected myself forward 20 years and during my time as a student and looked at the demographic profile of the law school now, I would have been hugely surprised. I would have been astounded. 7 female professors, which makes up 40% of the professoriate in the law school. That's more than double the national average, and it's certainly a lot higher than most other law schools. Our first female head of school in over 300 years, and half of our teaching and research staff are female. So I'm very proud to be a member of such a vibrant, progressive and diverse teaching and research community, and I'm grateful to work with a really excellent group of talented and collegiate scholars within the law school now. I'm not going to name you all, you know who you are. David Garland tried to persuade me to do a PhD, but sadly the lack of coin in my pocket made me decide to move on, and I took my tentative steps into the world of work. I couldn't find a photograph of any of my ex-government colleagues, which they're probably immensely grateful for. Well, the only ones I could find were from an old Christmas party, and I was sure they didn't want me to use those. I look back very fondly on those days in the criminology research branch. None of us had a computer on our desks. Simon and Anderson and I, on a sunny day, used to regularly climb out the window and work on the balcony of St Andrew's House. We routinely sent green envelopes off to the typing pool and then they didn't come back for days. It was great. You had time to sit and think and construct well-crafted letters with proper spelling and grammar. It's a very different research environment to what it is nowadays, not just in organisational terms, because research was very much a centralised resource in those days rather than kind of devolved to different policy areas, but in very, many other ways as well. It was an interesting experience politically, bearing in mind that this was in the time of the last Tory government in Scotland. There's probably some people in the room that don't remember a Tory government. Ideologically, research priorities were often driven as much by the academic community as they were by policymakers, and they often reflected anticipated demand rather than necessarily the reactive need of policymakers at the time. Technologically, I remember the introduction of personal computers to the department and the demise of the Unix mainframe system. But economically, it's very much the same. I remember 20% cuts back then in those days, and it seems to kind of come round in cycles every now and again. But it was really at the Scottish office that I honed my research skills. I think it's a very different environment now for a research officer joining, where they don't necessarily get to experience the full breadth of using the research skills. We were sent out into the field practically from day one, designing questionnaires and interview schedules and planning and organising fieldwork, doing a vast range of different types of projects. And I don't ever remember doing a project in government that was purely either quantitative or qualitative methods. There was always a mixture of both. The Crime Survey, Scottish Crime Survey, is the project that I most remember, and I think I was very lucky to be involved as an apprentice to Simon Anderson initially, and then taking it on myself later on. I was lucky to get involved in that project. I think it's an immensely important study, and also to have continued involvement in the study right throughout my career, and I'm going to talk about the study today in terms of my research findings. But I would applaud the willingness of the Scottish Government to expand it greatly in recent years, and also to continue funding it even in dire financial times. It's a truly valuable, if severely underused, weapon in the criminologist's armoury. There are lots of people at the government I'd love to thank. I'll mention a few, but you all know who you are as well. Jackie Toombs and Peter Levine for giving me a job, Joe Curran, who's sunning himself in Jamaica, Simon and Michelle and Dennis Ogue and Jim Carney and Bernadette Monaghan and Liz Levy and various others, too numerous to name. Time came to move on, and in 1997 I got an opportunity to join Edinburgh University. Now, Professor David Smith, that's David with a J, he'll know what I mean, had replaced Derek McClintock by this time as Professor of Criminology and began to sow the seeds of an idea to develop a longitudinal study of youth crime. Together, he and Leslie McCara, who was the co-director of the study, hatched a plan to track a large cohort of young people until the age of 30. Involving fieldwork in schools across the whole of Edinburgh to explore the determinants of criminal offending, and as importantly to find out why many didn't engage in offending and why some of those who did decided to stop. Not only would they collect data from the young people themselves, but from schools they attended, from the teachers that taught them, from the parents and carers that looked after them, the official agencies they were known to, and from the communities in which they lived. In conceiving such a complex research designed to study the lives of this unique group of young people, I think they were the true pioneers of data linkage, which has come to know so well in social sciences today, and it's undoubtedly proven to make it one of the most important and influential studies of its kind in the UK and internationally. So the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions and Crime was born, led by our intellectually fearless leader, David, who's endlessly optimistic, and our no less incisive and indomitable co-director, Leslie McCara, John Shute, my researcher, and I embarked on an incredible journey, strategically divided into the red knicker team, that was Leslie and myself, and the blue knicker team, that was John and David. We embarked on persuading every relevant agency in the city to let us dig through their confidential records, every secondary school head teacher to allow us entry to their school, to survey all of an entire year group of children, not just once, but over a 6-year period, and to persuade the parents of over 4,000 children to allow us to survey their children about their crime, about their drug use, about their alcohol use, and various other things. 16 years on, the study's still going. As Leslie never tires of saying, we're all fur coat and knickers, so knickers make appearance again. Despite its accolade, we've really struggled to keep the study going in terms of funding. But in 2 years' time, our cohort will turn 30, and Leslie and I are hatching a plan to very much realise David's dream of reapproaching the cohort again at age 30. In the meantime, more thanks are due to everyone who has worked tirelessly on the study to collect study data and make it such a success. John Shute and John Flint and Rona Woodward couldn't be here, Paul Bradshaw's here, Sarah McQueen is here, Aileen Barclay's here, the late Bob Bonner, Richard Withington, and the longest member of the team, the font of all knowledge, the wonderful Jackie Palmer. To David, you can't see his face here, but he was looking dashingly handsome for Princess Anne on this particular day when she visited the study in 2004. He took a chance on an unknown quantity, and he inspired me with his unquenchable inquisitiveness of people and his love of life. And to Leslie, who looks extraordinarily young here, doesn't she? I think she was getting ready to dispute Princess Anne's views on punishment. She is undoubtedly my partner in crime. She is one of the most incisive and brilliant intellectual minds in Scotland. I thank her for everything she's done to help me achieve where I am today, and for making every single day that we work together a real pleasure. I'm going to try not to cry. Okay, moving on to the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. Strong links between Scottish criminologists and government have existed here for very many years. And as Leslie has said in some of her written work, academics engaged in critical scholarship which was highly influential in policy terms for a number of decades. And the Scottish Office itself played a very important role in terms of shaping the key objects of criminological inquiry for around 2 decades, particularly in the 80s and the 90s. The links between government and the academic community of Scotland were forged even closer by the establishment of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. Here we all are, aren't we? A happy bunch. Actually, there's a few people missing. Sarah McQueen, you're not in there for some reason. The Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research was intended to kind of help build a new centre of excellence, bringing together academic scholarship and the new breed of intellectual customers that were emerging within government, and also within other key institutions as well, including Crown Office and the police forces and the Scottish Prison Service. And the aim of the new centre was really to bring together the skills of the existing Scottish criminologists, but also to build further capacity, enabling it to conduct research and provide expert advice to government on crime and justice related issues, led fantastically by Michelle Berman, Richard from Glasgow, Richard Sparks from Edinburgh, and Gil McIver from Stirling. I think it's been a huge success and really is a centre for excellence. These 3 Scottish universities, plus some others, forged a partnership aimed at working together collaboratively to develop a programme of research around a number of key themes. And I was lucky enough to be appointed as the network leader for the mysteriously named CJ Quest. I can thank Richard for the name. Working together with Paul Norris and more recently Sarah McQueen, the aim of CJ Quest was really to start building quantitative capacity in criminology. Now, strategically, this was very important because at the time, the Higher Education Funding Council had identified that quantitative social science was a particular concern because supply was seen to be insufficient, particularly as this subject, the social sciences, underpinned many other disciplines. Criminology and socio-legal studies were identified as being amongst those areas that were most vulnerable to the deficit in quantitative methods training, to the extent that this had actually weakened their ability to progress intellectually and to feed in effectively into the policy process. So having started with the modest aim of building quantitative criminology, I soon found myself moving in a slightly more ambitious territory when the ESRC and the Scottish Funding Council in 2007 announced a call to conduct a scoping study of quantitative methods capacity building needs in Scotland. We embarked on a study to scope out the dearth, not just in criminology, but in the whole of the social sciences, in every university and every subject discipline. Our findings revealed a much deeper problem than had previously been imagined. Despite an incredibly rich data infrastructure, and Scotland is incredibly lucky to have so much data, and there were pockets of real analytical expertise in Scotland, but there was evidence that Scotland had fallen behind the rest of the UK in terms of quantitative skills. Methods training was really only being concentrated in a small number of disciplinary areas. Expertise was scattered very much across institutions and subject areas, and there would seem to be no unifying or coordinated strategic approach to training or teaching. So what we identified was needed was a strategically focused capacity building initiative, and along came Acumen. Acumen was, or is, continues to be, an interdisciplinary, multi-institutional network of scholars with a collective aim of building capacity in quantitative methods within the Scottish social science community, and a small but very dedicated core team of people, along with 12 academics across 8 Scottish institutions, set out to build an intensive programme of training and knowledge exchange aimed not only at building individual skills in quantitative methods, but bringing together communities of academics and non-academics who had an interest in developing further research in this area. So over the course of 3.5 years, we built up a network of 1,500 people from our original estimate of 400. We ran 30 training courses, 23 major knowledge exchange events, and we funded 8 small seed corn projects. And we also offered statistical consultancy support to the social science community. I am extraordinarily proud of Acumen, what it has achieved over the last 4 years and what it continues to achieve today. It's gained a strong reputation as being a high quality training provider in Scotland. It's forged collaborative links with a range of other strategic investments across the UK. And more importantly, I truly believe that it has achieved a real step change in terms of the skills, abilities and capacity of our social science community, as it inspired many individuals to make greater use of our rich Scottish data. None of this would have been possible without the hard work and dedication of a small core team. The wonderful Angie Dixon and Heather Thompson, who are just an inspiration every day because they work so hard. Maria Philippopoulou, who's joined us briefly for a while. Helen Brown, who was one of our statisticians, and Jan Eichhorn, who just brought the most enthusiasm, ideas and boundless energy to a job that I have ever seen anybody bring. There are all my other partners and all the people on the executive committee. I haven't got time to name you all, but again, you know who you are. Thank you very much, particularly to my 3 main partners, Gwilym Price, Christina Ianelli and Lindsay Patterson, who is, I have to say, a true intellect, a gentleman and a most generous colleague, friend and supporter. Phase 2 of Acumen began in January 2013, and we transformed, with the help of a lovely ESRC grant, into a research centre with 4 main areas of research: crime, education, urban segregation, and we also have a number of projects on the Scottish referendum running at the moment, led by Lindsay Patterson and Mark Shepherd, which are doing some fantastic work, and all the stuff that you've seen in the newspapers about young people's attitudes to independence came from them. Okay. Moving on, painting a picture of crime in Scotland. I want to start with looking at some criminal statistics. Now, if you went back to 1928 and you wanted to find out about criminal statistics, you could pop down to the HMSO, and for the princely sum of 1 shilling and 6pence, you could purchase criminal statistics. This was the bulletin that was produced at that time. It was actually compiled by the prison commissioners for Scotland, and it was presented to the Secretary of State for Scotland, and it was a booklet that included everything. It had the crime statistics, the sentencing statistics, the prison statistics, everything in one booklet. Fast forward today, and so this is the earliest criminal statistics bulletin on the left, and the most recent statistical bulletin on the right. Today there are numerous statistical bulletins covering a whole range of different crime-related subjects. They are hugely detailed. The government provides all the data that goes behind them. You can download tables and mess about with the data yourself. It's a fantastic resource. There's a huge amount of data there, and I encourage more people to use it. The observant amongst you will have noticed that one important thing, I don't know whether you can actually see it, that the criminal statistics for 1925 took 3 years to produce, so they came out in 1928. Today it takes less than 3 months for the criminal statistics to be collated and then be available for use, so I think that's a major development. One other thing I just wanted to point out about these early criminal statistics is that there weren't very many charts in them, and the reason for that was you had to draw them yourself and then kind of etch in the numbers at side. So I would imagine there's a few Scottish Government statisticians past and present who are very glad that they don't have to do that themselves these days, particularly for the number of charts that appear in today's bulletins. Okay, so crime in Scotland. This is from the most recent Scottish Government, no it's not from the most recent one, it's from the most recent one that shows crime trends going back to the 1930s. And I wanted to start with the big picture of crime, because actually the last few bulletins have only focused on crime going back to 1970. And if you do that, you miss the fact that there's a big long tail to the crime trend. If you go back to 1930 and look forward, crime didn't change very much actually. It didn't change much over the war years. There was a bit of a fluctuation in offences. I should point out that in Scottish, a contravention of Scottish criminal law is divided for statistical purposes into 2 types. So we have crimes and we have offences. It's a kind of bit of an arbitrary decision how they were divided up, I think, at some point in the past, and nobody really knows how. But for simple purposes, crimes are the more serious things and offences tend to be the less serious things, although there's a little bit of an overlap between them. And there's also the added confusion that sometimes people call things sexual offences, which are actually crimes. So anyway, bear with me, crimes serious, offences not so serious. Although it's really only made for statistical purposes, I think it does broadly allow you to determine changes in what the public might consider to be more and less harmful crimes over time. So what we can see here is the dark blue line is crime and how that's changed over time. So you can see that it was fairly stable up until about the late 1950s, and then there was quite a dramatic rise in crime from the 50s up to the early 1990s before it started to come back down again, and it's kind of come down and plateaued for a while and come down a bit more. The overall figure that you can see at the very top, if you follow the top line, is crimes plus offences. So you can't tell the difference between crimes and offences from this chart. You can just see the overall figure. So it's also shown a dramatic increase, but it's shown a bit more of a kind of bumpy picture at the top. There's a kind of twin peaks of crimes and offences at the top there. So a massive increase and a very different picture, whether you're looking at crimes or crimes plus offences. But over that time, there was a 10-fold increase in crimes and offences, which is fairly dramatic over a 60-year period. Now, one thing that hasn't changed between the bulletins of the past and the bulletins today is that the statisticians who write them are often at pains to point out that if crime has gone up, it might not have actually gone up. There might have been something driving that. And this was also the case in the old bulletins of the 1928 example that I showed you earlier. So it gives you a few reasons why some of the crimes of, I think it was crimes against property with violence had gone up. And it tells you that the actual number of crimes may not be any greater. It may be due to greater activity or efficiency on the part of the police. It may be accounted for by the normal growth of the population and corresponding increases in numbers engaged in crime and numbers of victims. Or, now you don't tend to find this in crime bulletins anymore, it may be due to the ever-growing numbers of persons unemployed, to some of the more lawless of whom the prospect of a good haul may seem attractive. I miss those kind of commentaries we used to get in the old statistical bulletins. I think we should bring that back. There are other changes that have occurred over the last 40 or 50 years that would account for the large, or account in part at least, for some of the increases in crime. So the recording of crimes has become more routinized over time. It's become more of an everyday activity for the police. The rules that are used to count crime have changed, particularly in recent years. I'll say a bit more about that later. New crimes have appeared, but that's also counterbalanced a little bit by crimes that disappear. And of course, reporting of crimes to the police also changes over time as well. So the public plays a role too. But even if you take account of all those things, I don't think that would explain the very dramatic rise that we've seen in crime over time. There hasn't been very much research. In fact, there hasn't really been any research in Scotland around why crime rose so much over that period. Research conducted in England and Wales has suggested that it was mainly around unemployment figures, GDP and personal consumption, so increases in personal consumption that were driving up crime. There's also been some suggestion that it was around demographic changes, particularly the number of 15 to 20-year-old males in the population. But there's been very little research that has looked at other things. I mean, huge cultural shifts that we've seen, political changes over time, widespread industrial unrest and unemployment of skilled and unskilled workers, demographic changes, a changing, very, very different labour market, the decline of religion and the increasing secularisation of society. So there are a whole range of other factors. This talk is not about why crime went up or came down again, but I'm just saying that there's a lot of things that could be explored, both quantitatively and qualitatively, that need to be explored. This was not unique to Scotland. If we look at the available data for other parts of Europe, you can see that Germany, England and Wales and France all showed a very similar post-war increase in crime. Ignore the squiggly bits at the end, I'll talk about that in a minute. They're obviously very high crime countries. If you take those out, then you'll also see a very similar trend for Netherlands and Poland. Not so much for other countries. So in some countries like Estonia and Ireland, we haven't really seen much of a post-war increase. But it certainly wasn't unusual for Scotland to have a large increase in crime and matches other parts of Europe. Then, in the early 1990s, a body of literature started to spring up around a new phenomenon, the great crime drop of the 1990s. It started in the US in the early 1990s, which witnessed what was described as an unprecedented fall in violence, which saw levels of crime that were parallel with levels that they'd seen back in the 1960s. There were also falls in other forms of crime, burglary and larceny, for example. And research, comparative research that's been carried out by McVie and others in the UK, which looked at the crime trends across a wide range of countries, showed that for a decade from the early to mid-1990s, a great many countries had witnessed a major and widespread fall in crime, and that covered not just violent crimes but property crimes as well. Now, this raises the conundrum which Robert Reiner has described, which is that for 40 years between the mid-50s and the mid-1990s was the period during which most criminologists that are active today learned their craft and have started to taught the next generation. The great question was, why was crime going up? So we've had all this kind of 40 years worth of focus on why crime is going up. And it puts you in a slightly different territory to have to explain why it's coming back down again. Now, as I say, the purpose of today's talk is not to talk about why it's coming back down, although that is research we're doing at the moment. But I think that the key point that I want to make is that although there are a number of hypotheses that have sprung up here, there is still a lack of empirical testing of some of these ideas. And this kind of highlights some of the problems within criminology, the dearth of skill that would allow us to properly empirically test this new phenomenon. So just kind of focusing then on, I want to focus really on the last 20 years, the crime drop since 1990, and this is the most recent statistical bulletin this time. So you can see that crimes here in the early 1990s were high, and then they've kind of come down and plateaued a bit and then gone down again. Again, you can't see what the pattern of offences is, so I'm going to disentangle that, but just to say that I think the record, the bulletin headline for that particular publication was that crime was at its lowest level for a quarter of a century, so it's at levels that hadn't been seen since 1976. So for the non-criminologists, 1976 was the last year that Scottish national football team won every one of their home games, including beating England 2-1, and also the year that the Bay City Rollers had a hit with Saturday Night. So again, there'll be a lot of you in the audience that don't remember the Bay City Rollers either, but let's fast forward to look at crimes and offences separately. As I say, they are distinguished mainly for statistical purposes, but for analytical purposes, for the purposes of criminologists who are interested in looking at the change in serious crimes as opposed to kind of more minor crimes, it allows us to see that there's a very different trend. So crimes, that's the serious ones, went up till about the early 1990s. They came back down, they stayed stable for a while, and then they've fallen dramatically over recent times. So remember, this is police recorded crime statistics. This is what the police actually measure. And then offences, when crime started to come down, offences continued to rise and then jumped up a little bit here and then started to fall. So there does seem to have been fall in both crimes and offences just in this last 6 or 7 year period, although it jumps up a little bit there for offences again, but they're a very different pattern. So we need to try and disentangle what's been happening there. Why is it that offences were going up while crimes were still coming down? The other thing is this thing here, which is often kind of mentioned in passing, but I want to say a little bit more about the Scottish Crime Recording Standards. This was introduced in 2004 in Scotland, and it was intended to make sure that police forces were working in a consistent way to record crimes over the whole of Scotland. There was also a similar recording standard introduced in England and Wales, and it was also a more victim-orientated method of recording crime. So in other words, in the past, crimes that had previously been reported to the police had maybe been no-crimed for a variety of reasons, and they wanted to move away from that. They wanted to make sure that with a new victim-orientated system, that crimes that were being reported to the police were actually recorded by them. So it was expected to have a bit of a jump in terms of particularly offences, the low-level things that we tend not to be recorded, and it did in fact apparently have a bit of a jump there. There's a little tiny little jump there, but it's mostly here. Okay, but there's no consistent drop. When we talk about a crime drop, we can see that although there's been a drop in crimes, it doesn't apply to offences, so we really need to kind of disentangle these and understand the two separately. If we look at this picture in a slightly different way, so this time what we're looking at is, this is all the police business, if you like. So disregarding how many crimes happen in any particular year, how many are recorded, this is how much crime is actually recorded by year, and it shows you the shift over time in terms of the proportion of police business that's accounted for by, accounted for by these blue bits, which are offences. So we've got motor vehicle offences, which are things like speeding and drink driving and vehicle defect notices, and miscellaneous offences, which would include things like common assault, breach of the peace and drunkenness. And what we can see over time is that they've gone from representing about 40% of what the police record to about 60% of what they record. And then down at the bottom, where we've got the crimes, it's crimes of dishonesty that are driving things here. So the crimes of dishonesty have gone from about 40% of what the police record to only about 20%. It's hard to see whether there's any trend in sexual offences or non-sexual crimes of violence because they make up such a small proportion of what the police actually deal with. So this gives you an idea of what police business looks like in terms of the different types of crimes that they deal with. Not very much change in these other two categories here. So it's hard to tell what's gone up and down relatively looking at this, but at least gives you an idea that actually what the police are dealing with more now is offences rather than crimes. To look at what's gone up and gone down, we can anchor all the figures at 1992. So this tells us relative to each category itself, what's gone up and what's gone down. And it's a bit of a spaghetti junction, so I'll just explain very briefly. These three things at the bottom here, more serious things, malicious mischief, I think it used to be called, non-sexual crimes of violence and crimes of dishonesty. You can see that these have gone down. Fire raising kind of went up a little bit and then has come back down. But relative to what it was in 1992, these three things have all gone down. These other things have all gone up relative to what they were in 1992, not by very much for some of them, but we can see that miscellaneous offences has particularly gone up. Sexual offences has gone up, but that's mainly explained by changes in legislation and also historical cases in light of the Savile inquiry. But we can see that other things have gone up and then come back down a little bit. So these things have gone up, these things have come down. But that's across the whole of Scotland. And of course, we don't live in the whole of Scotland. Well, we do, but we prefer to think of ourselves as living in communities. And one of the areas that we're going to be developing in the Acumen research is looking at the extent of crime change in smaller localities. But at the moment, we're working on regional differences and regional trends and looking at the changes across the local authorities over time. So we've seen this kind of picture of reducing crime and kind of offences a little bit more kind of up and down. But what's happened in terms of looking at the local authorities? Well, we can look at the relative change, the relative difference of local authorities compared to themselves. The earliest we can go back is 96-97 because that was the year of local government reorganisation. So beyond that, the regions are different, and that's the most recent year that regional analysis is available for, regional data is available. So we've got about 15 years worth of data, and we're looking at crime change over that time. And what you can see is we've got some crime losers and some areas that didn't change very much at all over that period, and some crime winners. More crime winners than crime losers, which is good. If you're going home to Stirling, I hope you got your flak jacket with you. Stirling, Falkirk, Clackmannanshire, all at the crime loser end. So Stirling has had 40% more crimes in 2011-12 than it did in 1996-7. Some of these areas down here, East Lothian, where is East Lothian? I've lost East Lothian, it's there somewhere. Up, where is it? There it is, there you go. Dad, your area hasn't changed very much at all. And down here, if you were going home to the Western Isles, you might be quite happy. They've gone down by about 40%. So you can see Murray, City of Dundee, which often gets a bad reputation as being a high crime area, that's gone down hugely over those 15 years. And Fife has gone down too. So in terms of looking relatively from one time point to another, you can see what we've had some winners and losers. But we also are interested in absolute change, because obviously these local authorities are different sizes. If we look at absolute change, we get a slightly different picture. So the big loser in terms of absolute numbers is the City of Glasgow. So although it's only gone up by a fractional percentage, in terms of the actual number of crimes that it increased by over that 15-year period, just from one point to another this is, you can see it had about 10,000 more crimes in that last data point. Fife is the biggest winner, not just in terms of relative percentaging reduction, but in actual numbers as well. So 20,000 less crimes in Fife. You can see that the Isles are interesting, because down here we've got the Western Isles, which reduced dramatically in terms of percentages, but a tiny, tiny number. So it went from being a really low crime area to a much smaller low crime area. And up here we've got, where have we got them? We've got the Orkneys, there we are. So the Orkneys had a kind of something like a 15% increase in crime, but if you look over here in absolute terms, it's so small that you can't even see it. So, so it's interesting to look at that, but it also it makes us realise that actually we're looking at different sized populations. So we really need to pay attention to population size as well, and that gives us an opportunity to map out the trends. So this is the same 2 time points, just comparing the areas in terms of, really this is about ranking areas. When you're looking at rates per 10,000, we're ranking the kind of highest and the lowest crime rates. And our legend up here is if it's a blue area, it's low crime, and if it's a kind of pinky orangey colour, then it's higher crime. The big thing that stands out is City of Glasgow, which is so high that it's an outlier, which means that even if you were to spread crime out in a kind of normal distribution curve, City of Glasgow sits out well outside the normal distribution curve. And that hasn't changed over time. So it might be a tiny little area geographically, but in terms of crime per 10,000 population, then it's very, very high. The other thing that we can see actually is that there's been a bit of an east-west transfer. So if we look at Murray up here, that's moved down 1 quartile. If we look at the Lothians down here, particularly West Lothian and Mid Lothian, that's moved down a quartile. City of Dundee has also moved down a quartile. So on the east side, we've seen a shift in terms of areas moving further down the rankings in terms of having lower crime. And then we see, if we look at these kind of areas, how these have changed, the central and west side, all these kind of areas around here, Falkirk, Stirling, Clackmannanshire, and then the kind of Renfrewshire down here, you can see that that's actually shifted up. So we've seen a bit of a kind of a switch in terms of crime rates from the east over to the west in terms of rankings. Now, this is important, I think, particularly, well, I'm just going to mention this very briefly, but I think it raises challenges for Police Scotland. So we have one national police force, and we have very, very different crime rates, and they're changing at different rates. So I think it does raise some challenges for a single police force in terms of one generic model of policing that's going to tackle all the local needs. I'm going to leave that there, leave that one hanging. Okay, so that's all police recorded crime statistics. It's really important to look at the police recorded crime statistics and see how they're changing over time. But some of you may have been aware back in January of the headlines in the newspapers about the UK Statistics Authority, the government's watchdog on statistics, downgrading the England and Wales police recorded crime figures, and they were stripped of their official stamp of quality because of concerns that the police had been massaging crime figures down to hit performance targets. According to one officer, this had become an ingrained part of policing culture. Now, there's no suggestion, and I'm certainly not suggesting that this is the case in Scotland, but I do think it's a salutary message in light of increased emphasis on performance targets that these things are a risk. Now, we've known for a long, long time, certainly before the UK Statistics Authority caught up with the gaff, we've known for a long time that crime statistics are problematic. They're subject to fluctuation for a range of reasons, so the police sometimes increase their productivity and their efficiency because they're focusing on special operations that focus on non-knife crime or housebreaking, and of course crimes in those areas go up when they're focusing on those things. And we also know that not all crimes are reported to the police by the public, and not all crimes that are reported to the police are recorded by the police, although the introduction of the new crime recording standards was intended to fix that. But because we've known about these deficits for a long time, in the late 1970s, work was undertaken, particularly in the Home Office, to develop a new measure of crime. The crime surveys were created, and the first crime survey, the British crime survey, ran in 1982 in England, Wales and Scotland. And I'm going to say a bit about the Scottish Crime Survey, but I want to say first of all that the main reason, the primary reason for introducing these crime surveys was to compare to the police figures. The concern about the dark figure of crime, the amount of crime that was out there that we didn't know about because the police weren't recording it, was of great concern to people. I mean, bear in mind that this was Maggie Thatcher that brought this in. I could imagine being a fly on the wall to the person that had to go into Maggie Thatcher's office and say, we'd really like some money for a new survey that will tell us there's lots more crime that we didn't know about. It had a large-scale national survey which asked members of the public how much crime they themselves had experienced, and the whole design and scale of the study was constructed specifically so that we were able to compare what the police measured with what was measured by the survey. So huge emphasis went into designing a victim form which is sufficiently detailed to make these comparisons as good as possible, and that victim form continues to be used today. Now, by comparing crime survey statistics to police recorded crime statistics collated during the same time, we can not only estimate how much crime the police don't record, but also we can estimate what is reported to them that they don't record. We used to do this in the crime surveys of the past, but it hasn't been done for a long time, not since 2003 in fact. So for the last 10 years, any of the crime survey publications that have come out have not looked at estimating the rates of police recorded crime compared to the Scottish Crime Survey. So despite being the raison d'etre for actually running the survey, it seems to have lost priority a little bit in recent years, and I'm going to suggest that we should bring it back. I think it's a hugely important thing to do, and because I think it's a hugely important thing to do, I have done it. So this is the crime survey. This is the table that was taken from the most recent published survey, which came out on the 7th of March, so hot off the press. So you can see that, now bearing in mind that the survey has been sporadically funded over time, so we don't have measures for every single year, and so some of these kind of trends jerk about a little bit just because we don't have data every single year, but it looks broadly like crime was kind of falling from the early 90s. It kind of went up a little bit here. It kind of spiked in around 2003. Leslie and I like to call this the Cathy effect. We think this was Cathy Jameson frightening the public by telling them how much youth crime there was out there. And then from about 2008-09, it kind of has fallen consistently, and there's been a real significant drop. And because this is crimes reported by the public, we can be reasonably confident that this is a real fall in crime. Okay, now there are 3 comparable subsets within the crime survey that allow us to compare that data with police recorded crimes. Now there are some minor adjustments that are made to the police recorded crimes before this is done, but unfortunately the Scottish Government doesn't tell us what those are. So I have made a few heroic assumptions, and I've reconstructed what those trends might look like. So the comparable crime survey crimes are vandalism, acquisitive crimes, which I'm using housebreaking and theft of a motor vehicle. Bicycle theft should also be in there, but I've taken that out because I don't have the police recorded crimes on that, and violent crime, which includes serious assault, common assault and robbery. And what you can see is that this was the trend. If you take all of those together and lump them all in a big group, this was the number of crimes that were recorded by the police of those types. Nice, consistently declining trend over time, and this is what the crime survey said was happening. So what we can actually see is that there was a lot more crime apparently happening than the police were recording, and the nice, lovely downward trend that the police were recording is not necessarily what the survey was showing. So obviously that's a bit of a cause for concern when the gap between what's actually happening and what the police are recording is evident. Now, it wasn't the same for all crime types though, so if we look at housebreaking, we see this as a nice parallel trend. The figure for the police crimes is a bit higher than it should be, just because I couldn't take out the non-domestic ones, but broadly speaking the trends are similar, and they're very close together down here, which suggests that actually the police recorded crime figures are more or less accurately measuring housebreaking as it happens in Scotland. Vandalism, as you might expect, there's a bigger gap. Vandalism is one of those crimes that's often not reported to the police because it's considered too trivial. But interestingly, we can see that although police recorded crime statistics showed a bit of an increase and then a decline here, and the decline's mirrored here, which is good. So it suggests they've both been declining in recent years. But we have these kind of odd spikes in terms of what the public were reporting, which might suggest that there were kind of particular concerns around vandalism in those years that weren't necessarily being picked up by the police. Violent crime, this is all violent crime, so it includes serious assault, common assault and robbery. Again, you can see that the kind of steady slight incline and then a bit of an increase here, and then it's been steadily declining for about the last 10 years or so. In terms of what was being reported to the survey by members of the public, it showed a much steeper increase, and obviously that's concerning, although quite a big decrease here, and then it's kicked up again just in the last year. I think that's mainly due to increases in assault. If we look at serious assault, we see a very odd picture. This is what the members of the public were reporting. Not much change in terms of what the police were recording in raw numbers, but a big reduction in serious assaults being reported by members of the public. So that's a good thing. It suggests that serious crime in Scotland has significantly reduced. A little bit of a bump here, but certainly there's a much smaller gap between these two than there was in the past. But if we look at common assault, the picture is completely different. So we started off with these things being quite well recorded, but over time, common assaults appear to have been going up. So we've got a decline in serious assault and an increase in common assault. Now that perhaps signals something again in terms of a shifting of seriousness in these types of crime. It's certainly been decreasing, certainly in the last year or so. But I think what it suggests is that there are some changes in crime over time that haven't been reflected in the police recorded crime statistics. So we have to be careful about using one source of data to say that crime is going down. We need to understand crime in its totality in order to understand what the crime trends are. And importantly, we need to understand how much crime the police actually know about. And this is how you do it. This is taken, I've constructed this using figures just from the crime survey reports themselves. So what these columns represent are each of the survey sweeps. This represents all the comparable crimes that were reported within the survey. So it's not telling you how many there were, but that's just representing all of the crimes. And it's telling you of all of the crimes, the blue bits at the bottom are saying this is the amount that the police had recorded. So it's somewhere between about 30 and 40% of all those comparable subset crimes had been actually recorded by the police. So a lot of it not recorded. Of the stuff that isn't recorded, a large amount of it is not reported to the police, and that's actually increased over time. So it's roughly there about 60%. That's the green bits. So this is the crime that happens to members of the public and they never bother to report it to the police for a variety of reasons, usually because it's too trivial or they think the police couldn't do anything about it. But I'm interested in the red bit. This is the bit of crimes that apparently were reported to the police but not recorded by them. And we know that judging by the numbers of recorded crimes that the police record in these particular categories, and also in terms of what the public say that they reported themselves. So we can see that prior to the introduction of the crime recording standards, this was a bit of a problem, and it was a particular problem in 2002. About 25% of all crimes that were apparently reported to the police weren't recorded by them. The crime standards were introduced and this gap widened gradually until about 2009-10. but then they've started to broaden out again here. So that's suggested, well, there's two possible, there may be more than two, but there's two possible reasons that spring to mind. One is that old habits might be creeping back in terms of no criming, things that should really be in the police recorded crime statistics. And that happens in practice, and it may be time to kind of refresh the police recording crime standards and remind police officers that these exist. A second one is that under-recording of crimes may be happening due to police performance targets. I'm not sure if that's the case or not. Certainly that would have very serious consequences in terms of the UK Statistics Authority in England and Wales. So, has crime really declined? Well, crime in police recorded crime statistics terms has shown a steady decline. Offences have shown more of a kind of up and down movement. There's certainly been no consistent regional trends with both winners and losers in the great crime dividend. Crime surveys suggest that police recorded crime trends accurately measure some types of crime, but maybe not others. And most crime isn't actually reported to the police anyway, so how can we tell if crime has gone down when most of it isn't reported? It's certainly not recorded. Now, I want to kind of talk a little bit about young people, because criminologists have known for a long time that there's a very, very strong relationship between age and crime. And as far back as 1842, Adolphe Quetelet, who was a sociologist and mathematician from Belgium, trotted off to France and collected some nice data and looked at it and found this really strong relationship between age and crime. He said, of all the causes which influence the development of the propensity to crime or which diminish the propensity, age is unquestionably the most energetic. And in the century and a half since Quetelet discovered this, then the ubiquitous existence of the age crime curve has been demonstrated time and time again. Now, the age crime curve, what I mean by that is this kind of sharp increase in offending during the teenage years or the early adult years, and then a kind of gradual decline into adulthood. This kind of distinctive curve in crime data has been seen across different time periods, across different jurisdictions, across different ethnic groups, across different cultures, between men and women. The existence of it is so ubiquitous that it has become described as one of the brute facts of criminology, and as noted by Michael Rutter and David Smith in their wonderful book, Psychosocial Disorders of Young People, the most important single fact about crime is that it's committed mainly by teenagers and young adults. So although there's been a lot of debate within criminology about the exact nature of it and whether it's caused by prevalence, so that's more people getting involved in crime, or whether it's caused by frequency, so just more people offending more frequently, there's been a lot of debate about the theoretical explanation, but really not much about its existence. But recent changes in Scotland suggest that there's a radical shift in this relationship, and I wonder whether Rutter and Smith are still right, and I wonder what implications this has for criminological theories that have kind of assumed the fact that crime and age are inextricably linked. I did reconstruct this from data, but this is Dominic Monroe's idea, which is shamelessly stolen from Dominic. And it's the relationship between conviction, so that's the rate per 1,000 people convicted at a variety of different age points, and this is over time, and actually these time points are the time points that the crime survey was run. And the reason I did that was because I was also going to show you the relationship between age and victimisation, but it looked so horrible I decided not to use it. But what you can see here is that going from the earlier years, that's 20 years ago, down to today, so this is the most recent statistics, and it goes down through the red into the pink and then the light blue and then the dark blue. You can see that over time there's been a dramatic change in the conviction of young people. So back in 1992, 18-year-olds 18 was the peak age of conviction, and that was still the same a couple of years later, and then over time it started to decline. So there's been two things. One is a major reduction in rates of conviction amongst young people generally, so that's looking at the age span from 16 to 20, and also there's been a kind of skewing of the curve over towards the right, which now suggests from the most recent figures that the peak age of conviction is actually the late 20s rather than the teenage years. So that's a major shift, and it turns on its head everything that we've thought about criminology for a long time. And it also means the age profile of the people passing through our court system has changed dramatically over those years. If we look at reconvictions, also shamelessly stolen from my Scottish Government colleagues up the back there, you can see that looking in terms of the frequency, the reconviction frequency rate, Those who are aged under 21, the frequency rate has declined quite markedly over time. So it's gone from about 93 per 100 offenders or 100 convicted people in 97 down to about 60 there. So that's a 37% reduction in the reconviction frequency rate for young offenders. For the age 21s to 25s, it increased a little bit and then has declined as well. So again, in that young, that kind of early adult year group, it has also declined, and whereas for the older age groups, it's actually increased a little bit in terms of reconviction. So of course, the reconviction rates and conviction statistics are integrally interlinked. So many of those who are proceeded against in court will also have been previously convicted. But it does beg the question as to whether there has been this change in overall offending frequency over time or not. What we do know, and this is using some convictions data, also courtesy of Scottish Government, is that the younger you are convicted, the more likely you are to be reconvicted. So this is a trend looking at males and females over time, and this is the age of first conviction. So you can see that if you're convicted at a very young age, your likelihood of being reconvicted over a number of years following that is significantly higher, and it falls as your age of first conviction gets higher. Girls follow a similar pattern, but actually there's a very significant difference in the early years. So boys in particular who are convicted at a very early age are at significantly higher risk of being reconvicted over time. So trying to reduce the number of young people who are convicted early is clearly very important in terms of reducing the amount of traffic going through the courts. But how much crime is committed by these younger people, and has this changed over time? At this point, we hit a bit of a brick wall. Unfortunately, we don't have any independent measure of offending over time amongst adults or young people, which would allow us to say whether offending has really gone up or gone down. Indeed, whether the change in police recorded crime trends are the result of an increase in the number of people offending or in the frequency of people's offending, we can't tell that either. There was a national survey of offending commissioned in England and Wales a few years ago, and it ran for several years, but even that's been discontinued. And I think, you know, it raises an important point for me in terms of data richness and about understanding our field, is that as important as governments think that offending and reoffending are as key policy issues, it hasn't really been important enough to receive any consistent or substantial funding over time. So therefore we really have to guess what's happened in terms of youth crime, and the only data that we have to guess is through official statistics. So I'll run through one or two things. This is the number of young people referred to the Children's Reporter on offence grounds in Scotland. You can see, oh, this is the Cathy effect again. This was in the kind of early to mid 2000s when Cathy Jameson under the Labour administration thought it would be a really good idea to focus on persistent offending to reduce the number of persistent offenders, but unfortunately our policies dragged so many new kids into the system that it actually increased youth offending by 18%. Anyway, once they'd figured out that was a bad idea, they stopped it. But you can see since then there's been a very marked reduction in the number of young people being referred into the children's hearing system on offence grounds. Does that mean that young people are less likely to commit crimes these days? I'm not sure. I think a large part of it is that young people are being dealt with differently now. There are multi-agency partnerships that have been set up under the new, particularly under the new whole systems approach, but actually I think it was starting even before that was introduced to divert more people away from the children's hearing system and deal with them in more effective ways, hopefully, through a range of different services. The problem is that trying to find statistics for where they've all gone to is very, very difficult. So it may or may not suggest that youth crime has gone down. We just don't know. We haven't got anything to compare it to. But we can also look at other statistics around. This is the number of 16, 17-year-olds with charges proved in court and the prison population under 21. You can see those have broadly declined over time as well. So again, it suggests less young people are going through the system, although I very much suspect this little bump here and this little bump here are the kind of legacy of Cathy effect. But again, it doesn't really tell us about how crime has changed. So one of the things that we should be interested in is how crime changes over time. We can't tell that in terms of an aggregate picture of how young people have changed over time, just looking cross-sectionally at lots of different young people. But we do have an important weapon in our criminologist's armoury in Scotland, which tells us a bit about how individuals changes over time in terms of their offending, and that comes in the form of the Edinburgh study of youth transitions in crime. And I think it's very important to look at patterns of youth offending and how they change individually over time, because they do give us some secrets or some insight into how perhaps wider changes in society might have influenced the bigger crime trend problem. So I'm not going to say very much about it, really just that it was a very large longitudinal study of over 4,000 young people. It was intended to look at their pathways into and out of offending. We wanted to do this within three main contexts. One, by looking at their individual development over time and changes in their lives over the life course. We wanted to look at it in terms of the physical and social structures of the neighbourhoods they were living in, and also look at the impact that having interaction with agencies of social control, which included the police and the courts and other agencies, what impact that would have on their behaviour. So we did an awful lot of work in Edinburgh schools over a number of years collecting data, and we also more recently did a little sweep of a subsample to look at their criminal careers as they got to age 24. As I said earlier, I think David and Leslie were real pioneers of data linkage. Just look at the sheer extent of the different types of information that we have about one cohort of young people. We know practically everything about them. It provides a really full, rounded picture of these young people's lives. It allows us to look at their experiences, not just in terms of what they understood themselves was going on, but also in terms of what was happening to them through their interaction with a range of other agencies that they were oblivious to in terms of the impacts of those things. So it's allowed us to look in a kind of really in-depth way at their behaviours and what might impact on those behaviours. And I think David and Leslie recognised that really to fully understand criminal offending and desistance from it, you required more than just a simple survey. If you look at people's offending over time, you find that it's the norm. Most young people had been engaged in some form of offending over the 6 years that we studied. So we looked at what had happened. The first year was really what ever happened. So it's a bit of a kind of aggregate measure, and then after that we just asked about the last year. So you can see that in terms of any type of offending, these were 10 comparable offences, that most of them are kind of listed here, that we asked about then at its peak, and the peak age for self-reported offending was at age 14. At its peak, about 70% of the kids had said that in the last year they had done at least one of these things. So normal behaviour. The most common things were the kind of less serious things, as you'd imagine, kind of being rowdy and loud in public, the kind of breach of the peace type measure, and also graffiti. The more serious things were less common, but you can see that even at its peak, around about 25% or 30% of kids were saying that they'd been involved in something a bit more serious, property damage, theft, or violence. Now, so that's kind of overall prevalence. So that's prevalence is the percentage of young people who said that they had done it at least once. And we can compare that with frequency. So this is just taking the blue lines here is that prevalence measure in the last one, which showed the kind of big line at the top. And the red line is frequency. So the blue line is the number of young people at each sweep that said that they had committed at least one offence. And the red line is the average number of offences that each offender said that they had committed in that year. So you can see that in terms of looking at the total numbers of crimes, and this is the total numbers of crimes that we estimated to have been committed by this group over time, this peak here was determined not just by the population, who was being an offender, more offenders, but also determined by more offending amongst the offenders, okay? And so that's important in terms of thinking about our crime change. If we're going back to look at the kind of big picture of a crime change in Scotland, what has changed? Do we have fewer people who are offending, but they're still offending at the same rates? Or do we have the same number of people offending, they just offend less? Or actually have we seen a reduction in both? And those are big gaps that we need to understand. We can look at the relationship between self-reported offending and conviction because we collected Scottish Criminal Records data for our cohort. So this is kind of the peak age of offending in terms of self-reports. This is looking at a measure of serious offending. And then this is the peak age of conviction. So you can see that at precisely the point that the kind of serious offending was reducing was the point at which they were starting to be picked up in the conviction system. But you will also notice that the scales on the two sides here are very different. So the numbers of people that are convicted are an awful lot smaller than the numbers of young people who say that they've been involved in serious offending. So there is a bit of a gap there in terms of people's reporting of serious offending, and then who gets convicted for it. But it's quite difficult to tell from this sort of kind of aggregate picture exactly what the relationship between serious offending and conviction actually is and how the two are interrelated. I mean, we would suspect that it's the serious offenders who are still offending seriously in these ages that are the ones getting picked up for conviction, but we need to be able to test that empirically. So we did that by, I'm going to use a big technical term, semi-parametric group-based modelling, which is a statistical technique which allows you to take an aggregate picture. So this is conviction, this is the blue line from before, and we've disentangled it so we can figure out whether there are particular groups of young people that follow certain types of pathways in terms of their convictions. The biggest group at the bottom here are the people that are not convicted or have very little probability of conviction. This red line here are the young people, a small group of young people who started being convicted at quite a young age, and then they had quite a chronic pattern of conviction, so they were regularly being convicted across their life course there. There's a yellow group that were very similar up until about the age of 12, but they kind of then plateaued and diminished. So by the age of 21, their probability of conviction had virtually gone. So we've got two early groups, start being convicted very early, and then they divert. And then we've got another group here, which didn't start to be convicted until a bit later. And this group actually follows the normal kind of conviction pattern, if you like. The kind of peak age there is about 18. So that's the kind of biggest group of those that are convicted, and their probability of conviction on average doesn't really get very high. So there's differences in terms of the extent to which young people get involved in or get convicted, and they seem to follow particular patterns. What about serious offending? Well, this is not quite such a neat graph because I didn't have time to tidy it up, but it's the same technique, and this is using a measure of serious offending and looking at the probability of a young person engaging in some serious type of offending, and they're listed at the bottom there, over the 6 years that we collected data for. And I've coloured them in the same way as they were before, so this is the kind of chronic group, if you like, the chronic serious offenders whose probability of engagement in serious offending was high at all time points. There's a low group here, people that were not serious offenders at all or had a very, very low probability. There's a yellow group here who started early, maybe not as high as that group, but the probability of serious offending started early and then diminished by the time they were 17. There's a late rising group here, so they didn't start really serious offending until they got to kind of 15, 16, 17, quite a small group. And then there's this purple group in the middle, which are quite commonly found in some of the literatures on offending around kind of adolescence-limited offenders, if you like, the mid-teen offenders. They kind of restrict their offending just to that time period. So what was the relationship between the two? And this is a kind of horrible mess. If you've got any kind of eye problem, you will not be able to make anything out there, particularly any form of colour blindness, so I apologise for that. It was just because I wanted to use the same colours. But what you can see here is that in terms of looking at the relationship, there was a strong relationship between serious offending and conviction, but it was by no means a straightforward one. So most of those who were in this kind of early onset chronic conviction group, they were also identified as persistent serious offenders in terms of our survey. But there were also quite a lot that weren't identified as persistent serious offenders, including a small group that actually weren't identified as engaging in any serious offending or had a very low probability. Although when I looked more closely at this group, a lot of what they had been convicted for were motor vehicle offences, and we didn't measure that in the survey, so that's why that's missing. But quite a big overlap here in terms of chronic serious offenders and chronic conviction patterns. But we've also got a huge proportion of the early onset desisters that were persistent serious offenders over the whole year point that we looked at, but they were only really convicted at an early point and then they stopped being convicted later on. So we don't quite understand why we've got this gap between the two, and also there's other kind of people making up that group. I'm particularly interested in these ones here, who are 35% of people that reported some engagement in serious offending. 10% of them here were persistent serious offenders, but they weren't convicted in terms of the official data. So we've got an overlap. We've got all these people down here that fly under the radar, and we've got quite a large number of persistent serious offenders in these groups, but particularly this one where persistent serious offending carried on to age 17, but by the time they were age kind of 17 or so in our data, their chance of conviction was very low. So understanding these. Now, I don't have time, it would take me forever to go and do a further talk about precisely why there's this difference between conviction and offending. So if you want to kind of understand some of those, then I refer you to Leslie and I's published works. But further analysis of our study has certainly shown that the way that the youth justice system and the adult criminal justice system processes and labels and recycles certain individuals, especially the deprived and the vulnerable with problematic backgrounds, the more likely they are to be convicted. And they're more likely to be convicted early, which, as we have seen, when you're convicted early, the likelihood of you being reconvicted time and time again is highly increased. So I'm not going to look into exploring the impact of interactions, but I hope that I have convinced you of the need to know more about the offending population and the changes that occur within that population, both at an aggregate level, but also individual change over the life cycle, in order to fully understand what might be behind some of the changes in crime in Scotland. I'm at the end. You'll be glad to know anyone that's nodded off, give them a nudge now. I'm on the last lap. Okay, these are my kind of final messages. In an inaugural, you're supposed to kind of talk about a vision or some kind of big grand statement. So these are my big grand statements. First of all, I think that we need to move towards a greater critical engagement with numbers around crime. So we can both develop and we can challenge current thinking and not necessarily just take published statistics or patterns that other people have provided at face value. And I don't mean simple mindless analysis of data and production. There's not been a single table in this presentation, you will have noticed, and I haven't thrown a whole lot of statistics at you. I've tried to present things in charts and graphs so that they're kind of easier to understand. And what I really want to do is increase the amount of critical positivism. Leslie and I think one of our biggest accolades was being described as psychotic positivists once at a conference. I'd like to think I'm not so much psychotic, but certainly critical. I don't take numbers for granted. I don't just want to kind of use numbers for the sake of using numbers. I want it to drive theory, and that's a very important part of my vision for developing quantitative criminology. And also methodological pluralism, this move away from a divide between the quanti people and the quali people, and a greater belief in the validity of a diversity of views and methodological approaches in order that these two separate groups of scholars, and they are kind of in large part working separately at the moment, could coexist more easily. And I think that the discipline of criminology would benefit from that hugely. There's a rich amount of data that exists around crime, and I think we need to start challenging existing theories around crime and around desistance. Is the age-crime relationship shifting, and what might explain this? What factors underpin desistance from crime? And might these be impacted by wider social and economic change? And how should we deal with the criminal justice population in an era of falling serious crime? Is an increasing population, an increasing prison population, really an appropriate response or a suitable response when we see that crime, particularly serious crime, is going down hugely? I'm going to make my usual plea for more data, and in particular a large-scale survey of offending that would really allow us to mirror the victim survey. If we're truly interested in why crime is changing, then surely we should be asking the people who commit it, as well as, rather than instead of, the people who experience it. And also, my last message is, my children, who are sitting over there, Aaron and Lise, will tell you that they've never eaten a mushroom in their lives. And the reason they think they've never eaten a mushroom in their lives is because I disguise it. I grate it up and chop it into tiny little pieces and hide it in their mince so that they don't know it's there. And in my years of education, I never ever did a methods training course. I never had a course that said methods at the end of it. And I left university what I think to be well equipped with methods training, which has been enhanced over the years. I believe that teaching methods isn't about sticking methods on the end of something. We should be teaching it, infusing it into our teaching, infusing it into our learning. And I hope that if we can kind of encourage more people and present some of the kind of findings that I've presented today in terms of learning about and understanding about crime using quantitative data, then teaching methods should be about getting children to eat their vegetables without knowing it. Final thank yous. Just all the team at Acumen who are wonderful, all my current colleagues in the law school, my SCCJR colleagues who put up with me, Leslie, who is my best friend and mentor, and my family and friends, and my lovely children, and my husband Neil, without whom none of it would be possible. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Susan on your behalf for a wonderfully rich and energizing and passionate, not psychotic, I think, evangelizing lecture. I think we have an opportunity to discuss some of this, some of the content of the lecture in a moment. There's going to be a reception in the McEwen reception hall, which is obviously at the back of the hall. I think the best way to get there is to go around the side of the hall, in through the old medical quadrangle and stairway 2, and you're all most welcome to that, to ask any questions then and there if you have any. Now, I think also, just by way of conclusion to the lecture, I think there are 2 members of the audience who, despite the references to having been conned over mushrooms, are sufficiently untraumatized, I think, to want to thank you directly. So can I ask Aaron and Elise to come up and make the presentation? So this is on behalf of the family and the audience.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.